Audie Murphy received 24 decorations. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and 3 citations for the Purple Heart. In fact, his life is such a vital part of the American way.
They were icons of Hollywood's golden age, the matinee idols whose faces lit up the silver screen and whose names filled theaters across the nation. Audiences saw them as larger-than-life heroes, men who carried themselves with courage, charm, and charisma. But behind the carefully polished images crafted by studios, a hidden truth lurked, one that the public rarely learned about, and one that Hollywood itself often tried to bury beneath layers of glamour. These actors weren't simply pretending to be heroes in front of the cameras. Many of them had lived through real combat, stared down death, and in some cases taken lives with their own hands. They weren't just men with scripts and stage directions. They were veterans who carried memories of blood, fire, and loss into every role they played. Before they held prop pistols or wielded plastic swords, they were handling real weapons in some of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. Before they learned to hit their marks on set, they were learning how to take cover in foxholes, how to navigate jungles, how to pull the trigger without hesitation. And before they portrayed bravery for audiences who wanted escape, they had demonstrated real courage under the merciless chaos of war. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of history that studios promoted in glossy press releases. These men weren't just war veterans. Some of them were trained killers, soldiers who were forced to do what few of us could imagine. Their military service records don't just read like standard enlistments. They are filled with silver stars, bronze stars, Purple Hearts, and even the Medal of Honor, awards that are not handed out lightly, but given to men who displayed extraordinary valor, often at terrible personal cost. For decades, audiences saw their strength, toughness, and authenticity in films, without realizing that much of it wasn't performance. It was memory. These actors carried the invisible weight of the battlefield, and it showed in their eyes and the way they stood, in the silence that sometimes spoke louder than any line of dialogue. Hollywood in those days had a strange relationship with war. On one hand, it celebrated patriotism and service, eager to show that its stars were just as brave as the soldiers who filled theaters. On the other, it carefully downplayed the brutality of combat. Studios preferred to present war as noble and straightforward, free of the psychological scars and moral complexities that haunted the men who had lived through it. And so, while the public cheered these actors as beloved heroes, they were rarely told of the nightmares, the trauma, and the memories that lingered long after the war was over. But that truth remained hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for those willing to look closer. What follows are the stories of 10 legendary stars of Hollywood's golden age who were more than entertainers. They were men forged in fire, tested under the most brutal conditions, and transformed by experiences that would shape the rest of their lives. Their battlefield courage was real, their sacrifices profound, and their scars, though often invisible, were permanent. Once you know their true histories, you'll never look at their performances the same way again. Number 1, Audie Murphy, America's deadliest movie star. At first glance, Audie Murphy seemed like the last man you would expect to be called a killing machine. He was small in stature, boyish in appearance, almost fragile compared to the towering Hollywood icons of his day. Yet behind that youthful face was one of the most extraordinary combat records in American military history. Murphy was not just the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He became a symbol of what courage under fire truly meant. His story reads like a script that no screenwriter would dare propose, for fear that audiences would dismiss it as too unbelievable. By the age of 19, Murphy had killed or wounded dozens of enemy soldiers, often while outnumbered, outgunned, and already wounded himself. His defining moment came in January 1945, when his unit was under attack by a company of German soldiers. With his men pinned down and in danger of being overrun, Murphy climbed onto a burning tank destroyer, manned its .50 caliber machine gun, and single-handedly held off the enemy for an hour. He was wounded, exposed, and vastly outnumbered. Yet by the time reinforcements arrived, he had killed or wounded some 50 enemy soldiers, forcing the rest to retreat. For this action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. But that was only one chapter in a record that also included the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts, and more. By the end of the war, Murphy had become the very definition of a combat hero. Yet when the war was over and he was thrust into the spotlight, the story grew even stranger. Unlike many veterans who tried to quietly return to civilian life, Murphy was pushed into Hollywood almost directly because of his battlefield fame. His photograph on the cover of Life magazine caught the attention of actor James Cagney, who invited him to Hollywood and helped him get started in the film industry. Studios quickly realized they could market him not just as a star, but as a living legend. His war record wasn't hidden, it was advertised. But even then, it was reshaped and simplified to fit the narrative that Hollywood preferred. His autobiography, To Hell and Back, was turned into a film in which Murphy played himself. The movie celebrated his courage, yes, but it also stripped away the darker truths. The truth was that Audie Murphy carried deep wounds that no medal could heal. What we now call PTSD haunted him for the rest of his life. He suffered from insomnia and violent nightmares. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, terrified of the images that came back when he closed his eyes. He gambled recklessly, developed addictions, and at times frightened those closest to him. His second wife recalled moments when he would wake in a flashback, confused and armed, once even holding her at gunpoint during a terrifying episode. These weren't the actions of a Hollywood hero. They were the scars of a soldier who had seen too much. Film historians have often noted that Murphy's performances carried a quality no one else could duplicate. The 1,000-yard stare that audiences sometimes saw on screen wasn't something an acting coach could teach. It was real. He wasn't just pretending to be haunted. He was. As one director put it, Murphy had seen and done things the rest of the world could only imagine, and that truth was always present, even when the script called for him to smile. Audie Murphy's journey from the deadliest soldier in American history to a celebrated film star represents both the glory and the tragedy of his generation. Hollywood celebrated his heroism but avoided his trauma. They wanted the medals, not the nightmares, the courage, not the cost. And yet in his films, especially in his quieter, darker moments, the truth bled through. He was a reminder that bravery and suffering often walk hand in hand, and that the men we cheer for on screen sometimes carry burdens we cannot see. When audiences watched Charles Bronson on screen, they saw a man who seemed carved out of stone. His gaze was steely, his words few, and his presence commanding. In films like Death Wish, The Magnificent Seven, and Once Upon a Time in the West, Bronson embodied toughness in a way few actors could. He wasn't just playing at being dangerous. There was something in his eyes, in his silence, in his very being that suggested he had already lived through experiences most men could never imagine. And that authenticity was no accident. Before Charles Bronson was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. He was a combat veteran who had stared death in the face from one of the most perilous positions of World War II. Born Charles Bukinski in 1921, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, Bronson grew up in the harsh coal mining towns of Pennsylvania. His childhood was marked by poverty and hardship. He worked in the mines as a teenager, covered in coal dust, laboring in the darkness for just a few cents an hour. This early struggle would shape not only his physique, but his stoic personality. Then, in 1943, his life took a dramatic turn when he was drafted into the Army Air Forces. Bronson was trained as an aerial gunner and assigned to a bomber crew. Specifically, he served as a tail gunner, the man positioned in the very back of the aircraft, charged with defending it from enemy fighters. The job was as lonely as it was dangerous. Encased in a small, cramped turret with little protection, the tail gunner's role was to stare into the sky behind the bomber, waiting for enemy planes to appear, and then unleash a barrage of fire with his twin .50 caliber machine guns. It was a position of unimaginable pressure. Every mission meant the difference between life and death for the entire crew. Bomber crews in Europe and the Pacific faced some of the highest casualty rates of the war. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman during the height of combat could be measured in weeks. Tail gunners in particular had one of the most exposed and terrifying jobs. When enemy fighters attacked, they came in head-on or from the rear, and it was the tail gunner who faced them first, often drawing their concentrated fire. Bronson flew in multiple missions where each takeoff could have been his last. It was in those moments, sealed in his turret at 20,000 feet, that Bronson learned what real toughness meant. The icy cold at altitude, the deafening roar of engines, the tracer rounds slicing past the glass canopy, all of it burned itself into his memory. Unlike Hollywood gunfights, where an actor could always walk off the set, Bronson's battles had no retakes. If he faltered, the result was death. After the war, Bronson rarely spoke in detail about his combat experiences. But when he did, it was with the kind of brevity that revealed volumes. "I suppose I look like a tough customer," he once said. "But it's not something I put on for the camera. When you've seen real violence up close, it stays with you." That statement wasn't bravado. It was truth. He knew what it was to fire a machine gun at another human being, to feel the aircraft shudder from enemy hits, to watch friends vanish in smoke and flame. That knowledge never left him. What's remarkable is how those experiences translated into his acting. Directors and critics alike noticed that Bronson had a quality that couldn't be faked. He spoke little in his roles, often relying on his physical presence and a look that conveyed volumes. Film historian Sergio Leone, who cast Bronson as the mysterious gunman in Once Upon a Time in the West, explained it best. "Charles has a face that looks like it has experienced everything. You cannot fake that quality. It comes from actually having seen life and death up close. That was the essence of Bronson's power as a screen presence. While other actors performed toughness, Bronson lived it. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was weight. His eyes weren't cold because he was trying to be intimidating. They were cold because they had seen too much. When he stood still on screen, it wasn't a lack of expression. It was the steadiness of a man who had been forced to keep calm in the most dangerous situations imaginable. After returning from the war, Bronson tried to return to ordinary life, working again in the coal mines. But the GI Bill offered new opportunities. He studied art, then drifted into acting, discovering a new way to channel his discipline and intensity. At first, Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't conventionally handsome, and he didn't have the slick polish of other leading men. But as the years went by, it became clear that Bronson had something others didn't: authenticity. His breakthrough came slowly, in supporting roles that showcased his toughness. But eventually, his aura of danger and silence made him a natural for westerns, war films, and thrillers. By the 1960s and 70s, he had become one of the most popular stars in the world, particularly in Europe, where audiences responded to his raw, minimalist style. Film critic Roger Ebert once observed, "Bronson doesn't play tough guys. He simply is one." That statement speaks to the connection between his past and his performances. The man who had fired machine guns at enemy fighters didn't need to pretend when he picked up a prop pistol on screen. The man who had survived mission after mission in the tail of a bomber didn't need to rehearse how to stare down danger. He already knew. And yet behind the stoicism, there was also a surprising depth. Perhaps because of his own harsh upbringing and wartime experiences, Bronson often brought a quiet sensitivity to his roles. In The Magnificent Seven, his character becomes a protector of children. In Once Upon a Time in the West, there's a layer of melancholy beneath the vengeance. This combination of toughness and tenderness made him unique. It was as if the boy who had grown up poor, the soldier who had survived combat, and the actor who had endured rejection all merged into one unforgettable presence. Charles Bronson's transformation from coal miner to aerial gunner to international movie star is one of the most unlikely stories in Hollywood history, but it is also one of the most revealing. His performances remain iconic not because of clever dialogue or flashy tricks, but because of the truth behind them. Every time he looked into the camera, audiences weren't just seeing an actor. They were seeing a man who had already faced death and lived to tell the tale. Few actors in Hollywood history ever embodied menace the way Lee Marvin did. Tall, lean, with a gravelly voice and a glare that could cut through steel, Marvin became famous for playing tough. Violent men in films like The Killers, Point Blank, and The Dirty Dozen. Audiences believed him because there was something in his performances that went beyond acting. His violence didn't feel staged. It felt lived in, authentic. And the reason was simple. Lee Marvin wasn't just pretending to be a man who had seen combat. He had been there. He had faced death, inflicted it, and carried the scars forever. Born in 1924 in New York, Marvin grew up restless and rebellious, a boy who often found himself in trouble. When World War II erupted, he didn't hesitate to enlist, joining the United States Marine Corps in 1942. He was assigned to the 4th Marine Division and trained as a scout sniper, one of the most dangerous and specialized roles in the military. Snipers weren't just ordinary infantrymen. They operated on the edges of battle, hidden and exposed at once, responsible for killing enemies from a distance and providing cover for their comrades. It was a role that required patience, discipline, and the cold ability to take life without hesitation. Marvin's combat experience was as brutal as it gets. In 1944, he took part in the invasion of Saipan, one of the fiercest battles of the Pacific Theater. The fighting there was savage, fought in dense jungle and unforgiving terrain against an enemy that preferred death to surrender. Marvin was right in the thick of it, moving through the chaos with his sniper rifle, hunting and being hunted in return. The battle pushed him to the limit, and it was there that he nearly lost his life. Machine gun fire tore through his body, severing his sciatic nerve and leaving him gravely wounded. For his injuries, he received the Purple Heart, but the damage ended his military career. At just 20 years old, Marvin was medically discharged, left to piece together a life after seeing and surviving more than most men ever would. Unlike some veterans who kept their war experiences locked away, Marvin was unusually open about the impact of combat on his life. In interviews, he often spoke candidly about how close he came to dying, how war stripped away illusions. "Once you faced a machine gun firing at you," he once said, "everything else in life seems small." That perspective never left him, and it shaped the man he became both on and off screen. When Marvin turned to acting, first in theater and later in film, he brought with him the authenticity of a man who had truly faced violence. Directors quickly noticed that when Marvin played killers, soldiers, or gangsters, there was something disturbingly real about his performances. John Boorman, who directed him in Point Blank, once recalled, "Lee told me he wasn't acting in the violent scenes. He was remembering." That honesty made Marvin unique. Where other actors mimicked violence, Marvin relived it. His 1,000-yard stare wasn't a performance trick. It was the lingering echo of Saipan. Marvin's acting style was raw, stripped of artifice. He didn't overplay emotions or rely on theatrical gestures. Instead, he delivered his lines with an almost documentary-like naturalism, as if he were less concerned with entertaining and more concerned with telling the truth. Even in moments of comedy, like his Oscar-winning performance in Cat Ballou, there was an undercurrent of real toughness, a reminder that behind the laughter stood a man who had lived through hell. The physical wound he carried from Saipan shaped him too. The sciatic nerve damage gave him a limp, something he never tried to hide. Instead, it became part of his presence, lending weight to his movements and adding an authenticity that audiences may not have consciously noticed, but certainly felt. He was not an invincible screen hero. He was a man who had been broken and put back together, and that reality gave his characters depth. Marvin also understood something most Hollywood actors never could, that real violence isn't glamorous. It isn't the clean, choreographed spectacle that audiences cheer for in theaters. It's chaotic, messy, and terrifying. Director Samuel Fuller, himself a combat veteran, once said of Marvin, "Lee understood that violence isn't exciting. It's ugly. It's something you survive, not something you celebrate." That understanding bled into his performances, making them feel uncomfortably real. Off-screen, Marvin carried the psychological weight of his experiences. He drank heavily, battled personal demons, and often seemed restless. Friends and colleagues described him as unpredictable, capable of both great kindness and sudden explosions of anger. Some of this volatility likely came from the trauma of war, wounds that no medal or movie role could heal. Yet in his best performances, he channeled those demons into art, creating characters who were as magnetic as they were unsettling. One of Marvin's most iconic roles came in The Dirty Dozen, where he played Major John Reisman, a tough, unorthodox officer tasked with training a group of convicts for a suicide mission during World War II. The role fit him like a glove because it was a reflection of himself, a soldier who understood the chaos of war, a leader who knew that survival sometimes depended on bending the rules. The authenticity he brought to that performance elevated the film, making it one of the most memorable war movies of its era. What makes Lee Marvin's story so compelling is the way his real-life experiences fused with his Hollywood career. He didn't just play soldiers, he had been one. He didn't just portray killers, he had carried out that role in the jungles of the Pacific. And he didn't just act tough, he was tough, forged by poverty, war, and survival. When audiences watched him, they weren't just entertained. On some level, they were witnessing a man grappling with the ghosts of his past, channeling them into characters that still resonate decades later. Lee Marvin's journey from Marine sniper to Oscar-winning actor is a story of transformation, but also a reminder of the cost of war. His battlefield wounds never fully healed, physically or emotionally, and yet they gave him a depth that no acting school could ever teach. In him, Hollywood had a star who carried the weight of real violence. And it showed in every glare, every pause, every line delivered with that unmistakable voice. When you picture Jimmy Stewart, the image that likely comes to mind is of the earnest, slightly awkward man with a drawling voice. The heart of classics like It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Harvey. For generations, he was America's everyman, the neighbor you could trust, the small-town boy who never lost his decency. Yet behind that wholesome persona lay a reality very few audiences ever saw. Stewart wasn't just a screen hero. He was a real one. And unlike many actors who merely wore uniforms for the camera, Stewart wore his for real in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe, where every mission meant a roll of the dice between life and death. Born in 1908 in Pennsylvania, Stewart was already a rising Hollywood star by the time the United States entered. World War II. He had won an Academy Award for the Philadelphia story and was on the verge of becoming one of the industry's most bankable leading men. But while other actors might have seen the war as an interruption to their careers, Stewart felt a powerful sense of duty. Flying fascinated him. Long before Pearl Harbor, he had earned his pilot's license and was eager to serve. The military, however, nearly turned him away, not for lack of skill or courage, but because he was underweight. Stewart, standing over 6 feet tall but lean as a rail, had to put on pounds just to qualify. He did, and in March 1941, months before America officially entered the war, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Stewart wasn't interested in ceremonial roles or publicity stunts. He wanted combat. He trained rigorously, rose through the ranks, and eventually became a squadron commander in the 445th Bombardment Group, flying B-24 Liberators deep into enemy territory. His missions took him over Germany, France, and occupied Europe, and he faced the same dangers as the men he led: relentless anti-aircraft fire, enemy fighters, and the constant possibility that his plane wouldn't make it back. These weren't movie stunts. When Stewart climbed into the cockpit, the stakes were real, and death was a constant companion. He flew at least 20 combat missions, though the true number may have been even higher. Each time he returned, he carried with him the weight of responsibility, not just for his own life, but for the lives of the young men under his command. Those who served with him remembered Stewart as a steady, courageous leader, the kind of officer who didn't ask his men to take any risk he wasn't willing to take himself. He earned 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters, and eventually rose to the rank of Brigadier General in the U.S. Air Force Reserve after the war. But medals don't erase the toll. Like so many veterans, Stewart came home changed. Friends noticed that he was quieter, more withdrawn, and that his war experiences weighed heavily on him. The cheerful innocence of his pre-war persona had been stripped away, replaced by something deeper, more complex, and perhaps more troubled. That transformation bled into his acting. Nowhere was this more apparent than in It's a Wonderful Life. Released in 1946, just a year after Stewart returned from combat, The film has since become one of the most beloved in cinema history. But what audiences may not realize is that Stewart's performance was shaped by his war experiences. When he played George Bailey, a man crushed by despair and standing on the edge of suicide, Stewart wasn't simply acting. He was channeling very real emotions. In interviews years later, he admitted that the war had left him shaken, and that in some scenes, the tears you see on screen were not scripted but genuine. The haunted look in his eyes wasn't make-believe. It was the weight of bombing raids, of friends lost in combat, of the kind of trauma few civilians could ever truly understand. Director Frank Capra saw this depth and encouraged Stewart to pour it into the role. The result was a performance that has resonated for generations precisely because it was so raw, so authentic. Stewart's George Bailey isn't just a fictional character trapped by circumstance. He's a reflection of a man who had seen the fragility of life firsthand, who knew what it meant to face darkness and still find a reason to carry on.